So, I cannot tell you the truth because the truth is too complicated. There is so much evidence that eating a better diet will improve your health. But what does that evidence consist of? Well, we have, starting from the lowest level, we have cell culture studies where we can show that certain extracts, certain food extracts will have positive effects on certain types of cells. Well, that's interesting, and as a pharmacologist I find that fascinating, but that doesn't tell us about what happens when these foods are consumed by entire organisms, animals, including human animals. There's questions of bioavailability, metabolism. So then we do further studies which we call preclinical with rats, dogs, monkeys, reptiles, but they're not the same as us. They have different metabolisms. Most of you are not those types of animals. We have lots of studies with human beings, but frankly, many of the studies that are organized by supplement companies, nutrition companies, are really too small to generate the level of proof that as a scientist I really want to see. And then we have huge meta-analyses, prospective studies, epidemiology studies, which tell us something about associations, but they don't really tell us about cause and effect. And besides, when you have the very big meta-analyses, we might have a study of 100,000 people, maybe even 500,000, this happens, and we get a result that says, for example, if you have a diet which contains more omega-3s and polyphenols and prebiotic fibers, you're probably going to be healthy. But what does that mean to you as an individual? This is an average that we end up with. And people are different. There are different ethnic groups, different genders. In America, there are up to 40 of those. There are different eating habits and physical levels of activity. There are people with different genomes, epigenetics, metabolomes, microbiomes. Everyone is different, everyone is unique. And just because something is true in a population of 500,000 people does not mean that it is true for you. And the truth is very complicated in another way. It's very complicated to talk about such things. There's so much nuance, there's so much complication. I can talk to my colleagues in a scientific language about these things. And we are so convinced of the importance of these types of nutrients that I and most of my colleagues who are in this area, some people really well-known scientists, far more famous than I am, we're all using these kinds of supplemental programs. We believe in them. But how do we explain this to people who are not specialists? Now, I try to be a good scientist. I also try to be a good writer. And when you write about complicated matters, you can write in a certain language for the experts. But when you're writing for a lay audience who don't have 50 years of scientific training behind them, well, it's difficult. You have to use a much simpler language. And as any writer knows, you can simplify it to a certain point, but when you get to that red line, you step over that line and it's no longer simplification, it's falsification. And that is something that we are very, very careful to try to avoid. I always try to tell the truth as best as I can. And the truth is complicated in a third way, because it is dynamic. It does not stay the same. We may have a theory that we believe to be true on Monday. By Tuesday, we're starting to have doubts. By Wednesday, we're somewhat suspicious. On Wednesday, we're talking to each other and thinking, is this really how things should be? Friday is no better. We leave it over the weekend. We come back on Monday, and there it is on the lab bench, and it stinks to high heaven. And what we know is, because of new information coming in, we have to take this hypothesis and we have to beat it into a new shape. We have to change it, leave parts of it out, or more commonly, extend it. So for all of these reasons, it is very difficult, almost impossible, to tell you the truth. But there are some things that I do know for sure. There are some things that I know to be true, and I can share those things with you. I know, for example, that I'm from the Stone Age, otherwise known as the 20th century. I was born in 1950. In 1968, I went to medical school. Well, I had to. My parents were both scientists. Their parents were scientists. And if we go back another couple of generations, somewhere in my family tree, there is a man called Dmitry Mendeleev, who, as you may know, was the first person who designed the table of the elements. So So with that kind of background, of course I had to be a scientist. In fact, knowing my parents, I was probably made in a laboratory. I'd always suspected that. Now, my father had fought in the Second World War. I know it's a sensitive topic. I apologize. He was on the wrong side. He was fighting for the Allies. And many of his friends, many of his colleagues were injured. Some died. And he told me stories about penicillin. Penicillin was the new wonder drug of that time. And he told me how it saved lives. And that very influenced me greatly. I thought, when I grow up, I'd like to be someone who develops drugs and saves lives. And I went to medical school. I went to Edinburgh University, which was the best medical school at that time. And it turned out that I was their best student. And I was influenced by another Scottish pharmacologist called James White Black. And he became known as the father of rational drug design. He and his team discovered the H2 receptor and developed cimetidine, a drug to treat gastric ulcers. And they also discovered beta receptors and then developed a drug called propranolol, which was used to slow the heartbeat and reduce blood pressure. And I thought, because I was a student at that time, this is the glorious future. We will find new locks and we will design new keys to go with them, and we will unlock the true potential of our human health, and we will become healthier and better, and we will have a glorious future free from disease. How wrong I was. We have had 60 years, 70 years of expansion of the pharmaceutical industry. More and more pharmaceuticals are being produced, and yet public health hasn't got any better at all. I was already aware of that in the mid-60s. Even then I had doubts, and so I asked my professors, is this really the way forward? Is this all that there is? They had no answers. So I went to the veterinary school, and I started going to classes where they were teaching the veterinary students about using nutrition to heal and to cure their livestock, not just horses and cows and pigs and sheep, the commercially important animals, but also pets, dogs and cats, parrots. And I went back to medical school and I asked my professors there, your colleagues in the veterinary division, they talk about using food to help their animals to be healthier, to cure them from sickness. Why don't we do that? We're animals too. Now, they were really unable to answer that. They said, well, this is not what we teach. We teach drugs. So there is a problem. And even although I had become their top student, I got my exam, passed at summa cum laude, and everything was great. I was going to have a glorious future. I was going to be a professor in no time. But the problem was, I started asking the wrong kinds of questions. I'd asked my professors about veterinary medicine, and that was a black mark against me. And then I started asking, well, what is it that makes some populations healthier than others? And again, there was really, at that time, there was no answer. And I started to look more and more at what we call vestigial populations, people who live still as if the 20th century hadn't happened. People who eat diets which are very simple, which do not contain ultra-processed foods, which are based on the kinds of foods that people can grow, or fish, or farm, or hunt, or forage, natural foods. And what I discovered was that these populations, and I wasn't the only scientist who was looking at these populations, but it became very obvious that these populations were far healthier than we were, and they did not need as much medical treatment as we do, because they simply did not get sick in the way that we do either. And I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the populations, where these findings have been most obvious. Now, one of these is the Mediterranean diet. I think everybody knows the Mediterranean diet is healthy. It's good for you, yeah? Well, it doesn't really exist anymore, because the food industry has rolled like a juggernaut across Europe, from north to south and from west to east. And the original Mediterranean area, and we're talking now about South Italy and Greece, these are areas where olive oil is consumed in large amounts. Well, that's all gone. I first went there in 1957 or 1958, and I still remember how people looked. They were slim, they were healthy. The old folk in their 80s and 90s were running around like teenagers. Last time I was there, everything has changed. Everyone is much heavier now. They don't look as healthy. The hospitals are more extensive. They need more doctors. They're consuming far more medications. The World Health Organization conceded this last year. They said the Mediterranean diet no longer exists, except in one or two very small villages, and I'll come back to that later. All those dietary advantages have gone. But what was in the Mediterranean diet? Well, olive oil, yeah. The source of some very interesting polyphenols. Lots of seafood, lots of omega-3s and more polyphenols, lots of different fruits and vegetables, lots of phytonutrients and prebiotic fiber, and 1316 beta-glucans, which were present in almost all foods because of borderline contamination by yeast. All the nutrients that I was beginning to think were important. It's not just the food companies that destroyed the Mediterranean diet. You might say, if you don't mind me being a little political for a moment, late-stage capitalism or neoliberalism destroyed it too, because it used to be that a family could send one person out to work and one would stay at home. One person could stay at home and go to the market and buy fresh fruits and vegetables, or grow them, and then bring them back home and cook them. Very few people can do that now. Both parents are going out to work. They're time poor. So we go to the stores and we eat the shit that they sell us. Excuse me. So the Mediterranean diet is almost gone. And it's been replaced, according to the World Health Organization, by something called the New Nordic or the Viking diet. And that's a group of people who are actually relatively well off, who live in the Scandinavian countries, who are eating a diet that in some ways reproduces the Mediterranean diet. It presents itself in different ways. Obviously the vegetables and the fruits and the different types of fish and game are different, but when you analyze what's in that diet, same things. Omega-3s, polyphenols, prebiotic fibers, 1316 beta-glucans, and lots of phytonutrients. It's very similar to the Mediterranean diet. And these diets, when you look at what those ingredients do, they support a very healthy microbiota. So you have the right population of microbes inside you, the microbes which are your friends, microbes which support your health and do very, very many good things to you. Not just inside the gut, but in the liver, in the cardiovascular system, and in many other tissues as well. One other characteristic of these simple, traditional diets is they are not stuffed full of sugar. Go to America, as some of you have, I'm sure you know how awful the food is there. Sugar is hidden everywhere. If you buy bread, prepackaged bread in the supermarket, you can taste the sugar. They add sugar to it. I can't eat it. To me, it tastes more like brioche. No, it's not as good as brioche. It just tastes horrible. Tomato ketchup over there is 30% sugar by weight. There's sugar hidden everywhere. Not so much in the traditional diets, not so much in the Mediterranean diet or the New Nordic diet. And these diets are also full of phytonutrients. Now, I stayed recently with friends in Turkey, just on the other side of the Mediterranean, and during the course of the day, during the 3 meals that we ate every day, on one day I counted 24 different fruits and vegetables. And there was such a wide range of different types of vegetables. I recognized about 16 or 17 of them, but there were a whole bunch that I didn't know, I'd never seen before. And what I do know is that these vegetables contain these very interesting compounds called phytonutrients. Now, phytonutrients, let me tell you how they work. Plants build phytonutrients, broadly speaking, to protect themselves. They protect themselves from ultraviolet radiation, from infections, and from predation, for example, by insects. And the more the plants are threatened, the more they are stressed, the more of these phytonutrients they eat. So if you're growing them in your own garden, and they're exposed to different types of stresses, they will produce quite high levels of these phytonutrients. If you're growing them intensively and you're soaking the fields every day in biocides, chemical biocides, which prevent or reduce the risk of predation and infection, the plants don't produce so many of these phytonutrients, but traditionally they do. When you eat those plants, you absorb the phytonutrients, they get into your bloodstream, into your body, and they start protecting you in almost the same way that they protect the plants. We are like hermit crabs that walk along the beach until we find a shell that has been discarded by another marine organism, and we put it on to protect ourselves. That's what we do when we consume large amounts of fruits and vegetables in their natural, hopefully organic and uninterfered with form. These things are all very, very important. And the key characteristic of all of these diets, whether it's the Mediterranean diet, the new Nordic diet, or the diet that is eaten by the Hadza in Tanzania, or the Tsimane in Bolivia, they have a low calorie density. So the average calorific content of fruits and vegetables may be no more than 1 calorie per gram. The calorie content of many ultra-processed foods will be up at 4, 5, or 6 calories a gram. That's quite typical. And they have a high nutrient density, the traditional foods. But ultra-processed foods, most of these very interesting and valuable compounds are either only present at low concentrations or they're gone altogether. The polyphenols, the omega-3s, the prebiotic fibers, the 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans are at low levels or they have disappeared altogether. So they have a high calorie density and a low nutrient density. So I've been thinking about all of these things, and then one day I found myself here. Now this, some of you may know, is St. Pancras Station in London. And it is a piece of absolutely fantastic late 19th century architecture. It is a symphony in stone. It's one of the most beautiful buildings I know, and the inside is even more spectacular. It's a time when Great Britain had not lost its way. It had not sold out to the globalists. It still had an identity, and it believed in its future. They had not been sold out by their political elites. You can tell from the architecture, these people had hope, they had confidence. And I was standing there, waiting to buy a rail ticket. I was going to go to Nottingham to speak at the university there. And I was so impressed by this building, I turned around to the lady behind me in the queue, and I couldn't even see her because she was about 5 feet tall, in every direction actually, and she was wearing a huge hat, and I couldn't even see her eyes. And I said, "Isn't that a wonderful building?" And she raised her hat and she said, "Yes, my dear, it is." If that sounds like the Dowager Duchess from Downton Abbey, that's exactly who she was. Very, very aristocratic. It turned out that she was the foremost expert on 19th century history in Britain. Her name is Dr. Judith Robotham. And where my family are all scientists all the way back, her family are all government ministers and archbishops and senior architects. So obviously we got on like a house on fire. We started talking about this marvelous building. And I said, Judith, because we were on first name terms by then, how is it possible that in the 19th century, when people lived such short and unhealthy lives, how could they create architecture like this? The spirit of this architecture I can't see how it could be derived from a population who was so unhealthy and who lived such short and miserable lives. And she looked at me, put her hand up and said, "Idea. Where did you get that idea?" And I said, "Well, all the medical textbooks tell me, they all say that in the 19th century, before modern medicine, people were terribly unhealthy." And she said, "Oh, no, that's not true." And that was the beginning of a conversation. It started in 2008. And that conversation is still going on to this day. We formed a friendship on that day that has still lasted. We speak to each other often. I speak to her about medicine and nutrition. She speaks to me about history and politics. And it has been one of the most important relationships, intellectual relationships in my life. Because it changed everything. It led to a very long discussion about how the Victorians, this is what we call them, the mid-Victorians in the period 1850 to 1900, we had a discussion about how they lived. And it became very quickly apparent to both of us that all the textbooks were wrong. These people lived extraordinarily long lives. They lived longer lives than we do, and healthier lives than we do. In fact, they had a healthy life expectancy that was up to 20 years longer than ours, but they had no pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry did not exist. And the reason why they didn't need pharmaceuticals was because their lifestyle was so healthy, they didn't get sick. In fact, if you analyzed how much money the country spent on healthcare at that time, it was so small we could barely measure it. It was maybe 0.5% of GDP. That's increased at least 20 times. We're now close to 10%. Of course, in the United States, it's even worse because their diet is far worse. They are spending approximately 18.5% of GDP on healthcare. And if you go through to 2030, they think by then it'll be 20%. So the costs of healthcare are increasing more rapidly than their economy is, because people are getting sick more and more. And then we continued our conversation. I'll come back to that. And it became apparent that lots and lots of things were different about their lifestyle. It wasn't just what they ate, but certainly that was a huge part of it. They were more physically active. They were more physically active because there was no public transport. They walked to and fro from work. Their activities at home involved physical labor. They weren't any keyboards to work with. They worked with their backs and their hands, and they were burning more calories than we are. And the foods that they were eating were not ultra-processed. They were simple foods with a low calorie density and a very high nutrient density. And once again, lots of omega-3s, lots of polyphenols, lots of prebiotic fiber, and those magical 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans. We looked together, Judith and I, and this is Judith, and I want to say thank you, Judith. She made such a contribution. And we looked in detail because the Victorian era was documented itself intensively. We knew what they looked like because that is the dawning of the age of photography. We knew what they were growing in their fields. We had all the records. We knew what was being transported from the agricultural sector into the cities. That was all recorded too. We knew what was on the menus, in prisons, in schools, in hospitals. We knew what people were cooking because we looked at all the cookbooks. And then we looked at all the medical textbooks of that time, and they all said the same thing. This was an incredibly healthy population who didn't need anything like the amount of health care that we do. They didn't need the drugs that we are so dependent on, because the diet that they were eating was so protective. It was so good for them. And this led to writing a series of papers together. And as you can see, they were in 2008, 2009. And these papers are now widely cited. They are considered by many to be landmark papers in the science of pharmaconutrition. They changed all of our ideas about 19th century nutrition, 19th century health, and what the implications of that might be for the unhealthy way in which we live today. And when we published these papers, my medical colleagues wouldn't talk to me for months because they said, these can't be true, these can't be true. We, the medical profession, and our drugs, we are the people who improve life expectancy and health. It's impossible that such a healthy population could have survived without us. Talk about confirmation bias. So they said these papers are untrue. But then, because Judith is such a famous historian from that 19th century period, all of the other historians came riding over the hill like the US cavalry. That's not a good metaphor. Like saviors. And they said, no, the history is true. These are the right figures. This is exactly how it was. And at that point, all the medical opposition started to melt away. Let me give you another example as to how healthy the British population was. At that time, this little damp little island off the west coast of Europe, tiny, tiny little island. Look at where the British Empire extended. It covered 1/3 of the globe. It wasn't just the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. The truth is, the British soldiers and sailors and the workforce in general was the healthiest, the strongest, the most resilient in the world. And when the British generals and admirals did their calculations before a battle, they would say, well, one British soldier is worth about 2 Germans, 3 French, and 4 Spanish. Now you might think that's just supranationalism or jingoism, but those are the real maths that they used. And it worked, because the soldiers and the sailors were so well fed. As I said, they were stronger, faster, quicker, smarter, more resilient, they had less infection than any other army at that time. It was their key advantage. This was what enabled the astonishing success of the British Empire. So, just like the Mediterranean diet, just like the new Nordic diet, these people are eating a very similar spectrum. It's the same things you see in all of these examples. What you see, high calorie density, high nutrient density, a low calorie density, lots of phytonutrients, lots of omega-3s, lots of polyphenols, lots of prebiotic fibers, and I know it's beginning to sound repetitive, lots of 1,3, 1,6 beta-glucans. It is a fantastic combination. Everything that you would wish to see in the diet today. Unfortunately, the ultra-processed food industry has removed or greatly reduced almost all of these. They've all been taken away for different reasons. Perhaps they want us to be sick and stupid, I don't know. I don't wish to sound paranoid. But it's harming us. And guess what? When you take all of these things off the diet, it creates a situation in the brain which makes you less neuroplastic. Okay, what that means is if you don't have good neuroplasticity, it means you're not capable of flexible thinking. You become more rigid. You become more unable. It becomes much more difficult to accept new thinking. In fact, it's a well-known phenomenon that contributes to what is known as mass psychosis. Does that maybe sound familiar to you? The modern diet is making it individually and socially. So what could we do if we were to follow these recommendations? Well, we know from the records that those people who are eating a healthier diet have vastly better healthy life expectancy by up to 20 years. 10 to 20 years is very reasonable, and it seems to be very achievable. How can we move in that direction? Well, we try and reproduce the key elements of those healthy diets. And more importantly, or equally importantly, we're not just going to say to anybody, take these and I hope you feel better. We measure. And that's where we are different. We want evidence, hard evidence. We want numbers. As a scientist, I want numbers. Numbers from validated tests that I can use to determine whether you actually could benefit in the first place, and secondly, to monitor you and monitor your progress once you start this course. And I also want those numbers for scientific reasons that I can share with my colleagues and peers and accumulate in scientific papers, which I will then send to peer-reviewed publications, and we're starting to do that to change the minds of the medical profession and the people hiding in the shadows behind them, such as med-economists, and then finally, ultimately, perhaps, even our disgusting political elites. We need numbers, and we need, if our numbers are going to be taken into consideration, taken seriously, we need to work with the best available analytical facility, and we do. We work with VITAS, which is an offspring of Oslo University, who are widely acknowledged to be one of the leading forensic analytical laboratories in Northern Europe. This is one of the tests that we use. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, maybe more than familiar with this. And the whole concept is we make testing easy and as affordable as we can. So instead of bringing you to the clinic, having blood drawn, which requires the services of a phlebotomist, personnel, time, expense, test gets sent to you. And all it takes is a couple of drops of your precious blood. Many of you have done this. It's pretty easy. It doesn't hurt too much. And then you put the test into a special envelope, send it on. I mean, you know, you go online, and according to the European Data Protection Act, you use your own code, you access your data, no one else can see it, unless you give us permission to use that data in our research. And you can do that or not, it's up to you. But I believe that this is the future of healthcare. When more and more people are getting ill, as our healthcare systems become more and more overburdened, and as our economies sink gently into the West, and I know that it's happening here, and it's certainly happening in Britain, we cannot afford the healthcare systems that we have traditionally relied on. They're too expensive, and we have less and less money to be able to support them. We need to find a way of keeping people healthy or healthier that is more cost-effective and kinder. So these kinds of self-tests mean that we can disseminate health information. You don't need huge clinics, clinical facilities. We send it to you. You do the test whenever suits you, whenever is convenient. You make the decisions once you have the information. And you can use that information to control your own diet, your own use of supplements if you wish, and you can start to take more control of your own health and therefore of your own life. We have the tests, not just the balance tests, but we are extending. The balance test is something that we can use. Other people have tests that aren't too dissimilar. HbA1c, we know what that means. Vitamin D, also important. The gut test is our own. And I want to cite Martina Torresen, who's done so much work on this. She is a fabulous scientist and has produced a test which is so valuable and so important that I think it actually gives us a very deep insight into your overall healthy life expectancy. It's not just talking about gut health, it is giving us a lot more information as well. And the gastroenterologists and many other medical specialists that I talk to every day are very interested in this, and they're starting to integrate it into their own medical practices. And this is something that came from within Zinzino, and I think we can be very, very proud of that. And then not just measuring, we want to see the needle move, we want to move that needle in the right direction. And we have a series of tools which are on display here. This is known as the health protocol. And what we can do is we can put those ingredients that have been stolen from us by the food multinationals, and we can put them back into your diet. Once again, the omega-3s, the polyphenols, the prebiotic fibers, the 1,3-1,6 beta-glucans. And I believe that when you include these in your diet and in your lifestyle, I believe you become your own one man or one woman blue zone. We are creating our own blue zone here. Yeah, you're clapping, but what is a blue zone? Do you know?
Yeah.
Okay, I actually went to the original blue zone. It's in Sardinia. I was taken there by Professor Pest, who was the man who actually discovered the blue zones. I went to a village called Ursulai. The reason why they're called blue zones, I asked Professor Pest then, I said, why are they called blue zones? And he said, well, when we first saw these villages where people were living longer, I had a map and I had a magic marker and I put dots on the villages where people were living much longer and it was blue. That's why we have a blue zone. It's not scientific at all. So I went to Ursulai, I spent a week there, living there with one of the families there, and it was amazing. It was amazing to me, such a wonderful experience. They taught me how to cook their food, the flatbread, and some of the salads and the vegetable dishes, and some of them were really strange, and some of them were a little bit more familiar, but I loved them. And we were growing herbs in the gardens, and they took me up to the sheep pastures, and they taught me how to milk the sheep, and I was terrible at it. And then after we'd milked the goats, they taught me how to make mozzarella cheese, which is quite difficult. You get your hands scalded, you have to do it in very hot water. And I ate the local diet, and I was surrounded by people who made me feel quite young, because I'm 75, but they were in their 80s, 90s, and a couple of them were over 100. And I said, wow, you're really in good shape. And they said, oh yeah, we're in good shape. Why don't you come with us? And they took me by the hand and took me down to the local village graveyard. And I looked at the dates on the gravestones. I looked at the dates of birth and death. And yes, some people had died very young, very often in childhood. And some people had died in young to middle age in road traffic accidents or in wars. But most of the headstones, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The ages were 85, 89, 93, 103. They were all really long lives. And I asked my friends, yeah, look at this gravestone. Here's a man who died at the age of 103. And I said, well, what was he like? And they said, well, he was in good shape. When he got to 101, he started to slow down a bit. And I thought, yeah, that's how I would like to live. And that's why I'm working with Zinzino. I want to help you to live like that. So many of us spend the last 15 or 20% of our lives becoming progressively more ill. We are unable to express our biological potential for good health. And I find that a scandal. I want to do something about that. I want to give you the information and tools that you can use to gain that for yourself and your children and your parents and all the people that you love. Thank you.